The rain had been falling steadily for 3 days, turning the French countryside into a muddy nightmare that clung to everything and made every movement exhausting. It was October 1944, and I was Corporal James Hartley, a sniper attached to the 29th Infantry Division, pushing through the Normandy hedgerows toward Germany. The war in Europe had entered its grinding phase, no longer the dramatic breakthrough of D-Day, but the slow, brutal work of clearing enemy positions mile by bloody mile. My spotter, Private Eddie Walsh, huddled beside me in our concealed position on the second floor of a bombed-out farmhouse. We'd been here for 18 hours, watching a German command post established in what had once been a manor house about 500 yards across a valley. Intelligence said a senior officer was coordinating defensive operations from that location, and our mission was simple: eliminate him. The problem was the shot. The manor house sat in a tactically strong position, surrounded by intact stone walls that provided excellent cover. The Germans had positioned sentries carefully, and any approach close enough for a conventional shot would be detected long before we could take position. But I'd noticed something during my hours of observation, a peculiar architectural feature that might provide the shot I needed. The manor had a covered colonnade running along its second floor, supported by stone columns and covered by a tiled roof. Between the columns and the roof was a gap of perhaps 18 inches, a beam gap in architectural terms, designed to provide ventilation and light to the covered walkway. Through that gap, at certain times of day when the sun angle was right, I could see into the second floor windows of the manor. More importantly, I'd observed German officers using a room on that floor as a command center. Through my scope, I could occasionally glimpse figures moving past the windows, shadowy shapes that appeared for seconds before disappearing again. If I could time the shot correctly, if the target appeared at the right moment, if the beam gap angle lined up perfectly with the window, I might have a shot that no one would expect. "You're thinking about that beam gap again," Walsh said, reading my expression. "Sarge, that's not a real shot. That's barely even a theoretical shot." "It's a shot," I insisted. "Look at the geometry. The colonnade roof creates a barrier that blocks direct line of sight to the second floor from most angles. But from our position, with the slight elevation advantage, we can see through that gap between the columns and the roof. It's maybe 18 inches of clearance, but it's there. 18 inches of clearance, through which you have to shoot and then still penetrate a window to hit a target inside a room. That's not a shot, that's a miracle. It's geometry and timing," I corrected. "I've been watching the pattern. Officers come to that window every 45 minutes or so, probably for fresh air or to observe the perimeter. They stand there for maybe 20 seconds. If I can time it right, if the angle is correct, I can thread the shot through the beam gap and catch whoever's in that window." Walsh shook his head. "Even if the geometry works, and that's a big if, you're talking about a 480-yard shot through an 18-inch gap. The slightest miscalculation and you hit the roof or the column. And even if you thread the gap, you still have to hit a moving target through a window. The variables are insane. That's why no one's expecting it," I argued. "The Germans feel safe in that command post because they think the colonnade protects them. They're not wrong. It does protect them from most angles, but not from here, not with the right timing." We'd been having variations of this argument for the past 6 hours, ever since I'd first proposed the shot to Lieutenant Morrison, our platoon leader. He'd been skeptical, bordering on dismissive. "Hartley, you're one of the best shots in the division, but what you're describing isn't sniping, it's wishful thinking," Morrison had said. "A beam gap angle? Through an 18-inch opening at nearly 500 yards? Even if it's theoretically possible, the probability of success is so low that it's not worth the risk of revealing our position. Sir, if we can take out their command element, it could disrupt their entire defensive coordination in this sector. And if you miss, you alert them to our presence and accomplish nothing. I can't authorize a shot with such a low probability of success. Find another angle, or wait for a better opportunity." But there was no other angle. I'd spent days studying this position, examining every possible approach, and the beam gap shot was the only one that offered even a theoretical chance of hitting a target in that command post without getting close enough to be detected and killed. So I decided to wait and watch, not to disobey orders exactly, but to gather more information, to understand the timing and patterns better, to calculate the precise angles and account for every variable. If I was going to attempt this shot, I needed to be absolutely certain of the geometry and timing. Walsh had stayed with me, partly out of loyalty and partly out of professional curiosity. He thought I was crazy, but he was also fascinated by the technical challenge the shot presented. "Walk me through it one more time," he said, pulling out his notebook. "If you're determined to do this, let's at least make sure the math is right." I settled into position behind my M1903A4 Springfield rifle, the scope positioned perfectly to observe the manor house. Range to target is 480 yards. Slight downward angle from our position to the colonnade, maybe 3 degrees. The beam gap between the column tops and the roof provides an 18-inch vertical clearance. "Assuming your measurement of that gap is accurate," Walsh interjected, "you're estimating based on visual observation through a scope. I've cross-referenced it multiple times using the column width as a baseline. Roman columns have standard proportions. If the columns are 24 inches wide, which they appear to be based on comparison with the door widths, then the gap is approximately 18 inches. Margin of error may be 2 inches either way." "Okay, so best case you've got a 20-inch gap to shoot through. At 480 yards, what's your bullet trajectory?" "The M2 ball ammunition has a muzzle velocity of about 2,800 feet per second. At 480 yards, accounting for gravity and air resistance, the round will drop approximately 36 inches from the line of sight, which means you need to aim high to compensate." "Exactly. But here's where the beam gap comes into play. If I aim too high to compensate for bullet drop, the round hits the colonnade roof before it even gets to the gap. If I don't aim high enough, the round drops below the gap and hits the columns. There's a very specific trajectory that threads through that gap." Walsh was sketching in his notebook, working through the geometry. "So you need a trajectory that's high enough to clear the near edge of the gap, but drops enough by the time it reaches the far edge to still be within the gap clearance." "Right. And then, after passing through the gap, the round needs to be on the correct trajectory to hit the window and penetrate into the room where the target will be standing." "Jesus, Hartley, the more you explain it, the more impossible it sounds." "It's not impossible, it's just precise. Everything in sniping is precise. This is just more precise than usual." "More precise than usual?" Walsh laughed without humor. "This is like threading a needle while riding a horse. At night, during an earthquake." I spent the next several hours refining my calculations, measuring distances using mil dots in my scope, studying the light patterns to determine the exact position of the beam gap relative to the window, observing the timing of German officers appearing at that window. The pattern was consistent. Every 45 to 50 minutes, someone would come to the window, presumably for a status check or to observe the perimeter. By late afternoon, I'd developed a complete firing solution. I knew the exact sight picture I needed, the precise moment to fire, the specific trajectory required. All I needed was the target to appear at the right time. "This is your last chance to back out," Walsh said quietly. "If you take this shot and miss, Morrison will have you up on charges for disobeying orders, and the Germans will know we're here. I won't miss." "How can you be so sure? You've never even test-fired this angle." "Because I've done the math 100 times, and the geometry works. Trust the numbers, Eddie. The beam gap angle is real, the trajectory is calculated correctly, and when that officer appears in that window, I'll have the shot." At 16:47 hours, my patience was rewarded. Through my scope, I saw movement in the command post window, a figure in a German officer's uniform, moving toward the window with the purposeful stride of someone checking on the defensive perimeter. The light was perfect, the angle was right, and my firing solution was ready. "Target at the window," I whispered to Walsh. "German officer, looks like a major or higher based on the uniform." "You're really doing this," Walsh said, not quite a question. "Get ready to move as soon as I fire. We'll have maybe 60 seconds before they start looking for the source of the shot." I settled into my firing position, controlling my breathing, allowing my heart rate to slow. The officer moved to the window and stopped, exactly as I'd predicted, looking out over the defensive positions. He was perhaps 50 years old, with the bearing of a career military man who'd seen too many wars. Through my scope, I could see him clearly now, visible through the window, which was visible through the beam gap between the colonnade columns and roof. The geometry was perfect. The alignment was exactly what I'd calculated. I adjusted my aim point, accounting for the bullet drop, the distance, the slight breeze that had been steady all day. The crosshairs settled on a point that seemed to be aiming at nothing, a spot of empty air above the colonnade roof. But I knew that when the bullet followed its trajectory, it would drop through that beam gap, continue descending, and strike the window precisely where the officer was standing. Everything in that moment came down to mathematics and trust. Trust in the calculations, trust in the geometry, trust in the equipment, trust in my own abilities developed through thousands of practice rounds. I squeezed the trigger. The rifle fired, the report echoing across the valley. Through my scope, I watched the bullet's path. Impossible to actually see, of course, but I could imagine its trajectory through the beam gap. For a fraction of a second, nothing seemed to happen. Then the window shattered. The German officer jerked backward, the distinctive motion of someone hit by a rifle round. He collapsed out of sight, and the window frame was suddenly crowded with other figures responding to the crisis. "Holy shit," Walsh breathed beside me. "Holy shit, you actually did it. You hit him through the beam gap." "Confirmed kill," I said, my voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through me. "Senior officer down. Let's move before they locate our position." We gathered our equipment quickly and displaced from the farmhouse, moving through pre-planned routes that would take us back to friendly lines. Behind us, I could hear the Germans reacting, shouting, movement, the sound of a position suddenly thrown into confusion by the unexpected loss of a command element. The story spread through the division within hours. The sniper, who'd made an impossible shot through an 18-inch beam gap at nearly 500 yards, eliminating a German officer from a position everyone thought was protected. Lieutenant Morrison sought me out the next day, his expression a mixture of grudging respect and irritation. "Hartley, you disobeyed my direct order not to take that shot," he said. "Yes, sir, I did. You risked revealing our position on what I considered to be an impossible shot with a negligible probability of success." "Yes, sir. And you hit the target. Intelligence confirms you killed a German colonel who was coordinating defensive operations for their entire regiment in this sector. His death has created significant disruption in their command structure." "I'm glad the shot was successful, sir." Morrison studied me for a long moment. "The beam gap angle. That's what you called it, right? Shooting through the architectural gap between the colonnade roof and the column tops?" "Yes, sir. The geometry was sound. It just required precise calculation of the trajectory. Sergeant Walsh showed me his notes, your calculations, the measurements, the trajectory planning. It's some of the most thorough preparation I've seen for any shot ever. You didn't just guess or hope, you did the math. Sniping is applied mathematics, sir. Distance, trajectory, wind, gravity, they're all numbers. If you get the numbers right, the shot works. Even when the shot involves threading a bullet through an 18-inch gap at 500 yards. Especially then, sir. The harder the shot, the more important the math becomes." Morrison nodded slowly. "I should probably discipline you for disobeying orders, but given the results and the impact on enemy operations, I'm instead going to recommend you for a commendation. And I want you to brief the other snipers on your beam gap technique. If there are ways to take shots that the enemy thinks are impossible, we need to be exploiting those angles." Over the following weeks, the beam gap shot became something of a legend in the sniper community. Other snipers wanted to understand the technique, to learn how I'd calculated the trajectory and timing. I conducted several training sessions, explaining the principles of using architectural features to create unexpected lines of fire. The key is understanding that most defensive positions are designed to protect against obvious angles of attack, I'd explained to groups of snipers gathered for training. But architecture creates gaps, spaces, angles that aren't always obvious. A colonnade with a beam gap, a ventilation space between walls, a reflection in windows that creates a secondary line of sight. If you understand the geometry, you can find shots that the enemy thinks are impossible. Private Miller, a young sniper fresh from training, raised his hand during one session. "But Corporal Hartley, how do you even identify these opportunities? I could look at that same manor house for days and never think to shoot through the beam gap." "You train yourself to see geometry instead of just seeing buildings," I explained. "When you're observing a target area, you're not just looking at what's there, you're looking at the spaces between things, the gaps, the angles, the lines of sight that aren't obvious. It's a different way of seeing. And once you identify a potential shot like the beam gap, how do you know if it's actually feasible? Mathematics. You measure everything you can measure. You calculate bullet trajectory. You account for every variable: distance, wind, gravity, the size of the gap you're shooting through. You don't take the shot until you're confident the numbers work." Another sniper, Corporal Jackson, asked, "What if you can't measure everything? What if you have to estimate?" "Then you estimate as accurately as possible and accept a higher margin of error." But the beam gap shot wasn't an estimate. I spent 18 hours observing that position, measuring distances using mil dots, cross-referencing architectural proportions, calculating trajectories. By the time I took that shot, I knew the geometry was sound. And you were confident enough in your calculations to disobey orders and take the shot anyway? Jackson pressed. I was confident in the math, I said carefully. Whether I should have disobeyed orders is a different question. I got lucky that the shot worked, and that Lieutenant Morrison was willing to overlook the insubordination because of the results. If I'd missed, I'd probably be facing court-martial right now. The discussion continued, covering the technical aspects of long-range shooting, the challenges of calculating trajectories through restricted openings, the importance of understanding ballistics and geometry. But I kept coming back to the fundamental principle. Sniping at its highest level was about seeing opportunities that others missed and having the technical skill to exploit those opportunities. The beam gap technique, as it became known in sniper circles, wasn't just about shooting through architectural gaps. It was about thinking differently about lines of sight, about understanding that the enemy's sense of security was often based on conventional assumptions about what was or wasn't a viable shot. In November, I had the opportunity to apply the principles again. We were approaching a German strongpoint built around a church with a tall bell tower. The tower provided excellent observation of the surrounding area, and German spotters were using it to direct artillery fire that was devastating our advance. The tower seemed invulnerable. Thick stone walls, small windows, and any direct approach would be detected long before a sniper could get into position. But I noticed something others had missed. The bell tower had ventilation slots near the top, designed to allow sound from the bells to carry. These slots were perhaps 8 inches wide and positioned at regular intervals around the tower. Through careful observation, I determined that the German spotters were using a specific position near the center of the bell chamber, where they had the best visibility. And at certain times of day when the sun angle was right, I could see movement through one of those ventilation slots. It was an even more difficult shot than the beam gap, only 8 inches of clearance instead of 18, and the target was moving within the confined space of the bell chamber. But the principles were the same. Measure distances, calculate trajectories, understand the timing and patterns, wait for the perfect moment. I took the shot at 612 yards, threading the round through an 8-inch ventilation slot and hitting a German artillery spotter who'd thought he was completely protected by the tower's thick walls. The artillery spotting from that position ceased immediately, and our advance continued with significantly fewer casualties from directed artillery fire. The beam gap angle strikes again, Walsh said after we'd displaced from that position. Except this time it was a ventilation slot angle. Same principle, I said. Architecture creates spaces that can be exploited if you understand the geometry. The Germans build these positions thinking about conventional attacks, conventional lines of fire. They don't consider that someone might calculate the trajectory through an 8-inch slot at over 600 yards. Because it's insane, Walsh pointed out. Normal people don't think about shots like that, because normal people recognize them as essentially impossible. They're not impossible, they're just difficult. There's a difference. By December, the beam gap technique had spread beyond just our division. Snipers from other units were incorporating the principles into their work, looking for unconventional angles and architectural features that could provide unexpected lines of fire. Several successful shots were attributed to the technique: a round through a chimney opening to hit a target in a fortified building, a shot through the gap between a tank's turret and hull to disable the vehicle, a bullet threaded through overlapping sandbags to reach a target behind what appeared to be solid cover. Captain Williams, the division sniper coordinator, called me in for a meeting in January 1945. "Hartley, your beam gap technique is changing how we think about sniper operations," he said. "But I'm concerned that we're encouraging snipers to take increasingly risky shots with low probability of success. Not everyone has your level of skill or your thoroughness in calculating these angles. With respect, sir, I'm not encouraging anyone to take risky shots. I'm encouraging them to do the math. If the geometry works and the trajectory is sound, it's not a risky shot. It's a calculated shot. The risk comes from not doing the preparation, from taking shots without understanding the variables. But how do we ensure that snipers are properly calculating these shots and not just attempting them based on false confidence? Training, sir. Teach them the mathematics. Make them prove their calculations before attempting difficult shots. The beam gap angle isn't about being lucky or taking chances. It's about applied geometry and ballistics. Any sniper who understands the principles can learn to identify and execute these shots." Williams considered this. "I want you to develop a formal training program. Teach other snipers how to identify unconventional angles. how to calculate trajectories through restricted openings, how to use architecture and terrain in ways that create unexpected firing solutions. Can you do that? Yes, sir. Though I'll need time and resources, training materials, perhaps some mock-up structures to demonstrate the principles, you'll have what you need. This could give us a significant advantage in the final push into Germany. The more we can do to disrupt their command structure and eliminate key personnel from positions they think are safe, the faster this war ends. I spent the next month developing the training program, working with Walsh and several other experienced snipers to create materials that would teach the beam gap principles effectively. We built mock-up structures with various architectural features, gaps, slots, spaces between components. We taught ballistics and trajectory calculation. We emphasized the importance of observation and patience. The core message was always the same. See the geometry, do the math, take the shot only when the numbers confirm it's viable. By March 1945, as Allied forces pushed deeper into Germany, the beam gap technique had become a standard part of sniper doctrine. It wasn't used frequently. Opportunities for these shots were rare and they required exceptional skill and preparation. But when the opportunities arose, snipers trained in the technique could exploit angles that enemy forces thought were completely protected. I survived the war and returned home with a chest full of commendations and a reputation as the sniper who'd pioneered unconventional shooting angles. But what I was most proud of wasn't the kills or the recognition. It was the way the beam gap technique had changed how snipers thought about their craft. It wasn't enough to be a good shot. You had to understand geometry, ballistics, architecture, light, shadow, and the way these elements created opportunities that weren't visible to conventional thinking. You had to be willing to do the hard work of calculation and observation, to trust the mathematics even when they suggested a shot that seemed impossible. Years later, I was invited to speak at a military history conference about sniper tactics during World War II. When I described the beam gap shot at the French manor house, a young officer raised his hand. "Sir, when you were calculating that trajectory, what gave you the confidence that your math was correct? How did you know you weren't missing some variable that would cause the shot to fail?" I thought about that for a moment. I didn't know for certain. There's always some degree of uncertainty in complex calculations. But I'd done everything I could to minimize that uncertainty, measured carefully, calculated thoroughly, accounted for every variable I could identify. At some point, you have to trust the preparation and take the shot. But what if you'd missed? Then I would have learned from the miss, refined the calculations and tried again when another opportunity presented itself. Failure is only permanent if you don't learn from it. Another hand went up. Do you think the beam gap technique is still relevant in modern warfare, with all the technological advances in sniping equipment? The specific technique, shooting through architectural gaps, might be less common with modern warfare's different tactical environments, but the underlying principle is timeless. Look for opportunities others miss. Understand the geometry and mathematics of your craft, and don't accept conventional limitations on what's possible. That's relevant regardless of the technology. The beam gap shot at 480 yards became one of the most analyzed sniper shots of World War II, studied in military academies and discussed in tactical manuals. But for me, it was always about something simpler, seeing a problem that others thought was unsolvable and doing the work necessary to solve it. They'd ignored my beam gap angle idea, dismissed it as impossible, told me I was wasting time on theoretical shots that would never work. And then I'd hit a German officer at 480 yards through an 18-inch gap that everyone thought provided perfect protection. Sometimes the impossible shot is just the one nobody else has bothered to calculate properly.